It's the Writers for Readers radio program. I'm your host, Gary Johnson. This program is providing a radio platform for York Region and area people who are seriously writing books and being published. My first guest today is Sandy Ho with her book, No Way But Through. Sandy Ho's work spans literature, education, and community advocacy, focusing on the experiences of the Cantonese Diaspora and intergenerational healing. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Peru, she brings a unique, multicultural perspective. Her professional background includes over 2 decades as an ESL educator and curriculum developer. Beyond writing, Sandy Ho is deeply involved in the Live Out Loud movement, which supports the Cantonese Diaspora and encourages younger generations to reclaim their heritage. Today, she's here on the program to discuss her debut memoir, No Way But Through. Welcome, Sandy Ho.
Thank you, Gary, for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, what was the impetus of writing No Way But Through?
It's a really good question because oftentimes people think and assume that I had this moment of, okay, let's do it. I've always actually wanted to write. I've always had this longing and this feeling that the stories that I have inherited and also the stories that I have lived myself are worth telling. But like everybody else, life gets away and you just get busy. And so I guess the impetus was my children. As my children got older, at one point about 2-3 years ago, they started asking questions. And I still remember things. So I said, no problem, let me tell you the stories. When I told them the stories, first of all, I realized I didn't remember as much as I thought I remember. And secondly, it landed differently to them. They were just like, okay, fine, move on, you know. So I really wanted to have something in writing that to be able to pass it to them, but not just a bunch of dates and names that felt foreign to them. So I sat down with my dad and I said, hey, would you be able to help me? And Cantonese people are very pragmatic people. And so it was not about heritage. It was not about legacy. It was just, I have a problem, Dad. Can you help me? And he's like, sure. And he said, what's the problem? I said, your grandchildren want to know. And I don't know how to tell the story well. So that was the impetus that I had 2 people in my mind, literally, my son and my daughter, sitting there, imagining them wanting to hear the story in a way that made sense to them. And so that's why I started writing.
Had you ever written prior to this? I mean, you know, is there some background there about writing?
I know, right? The irony is ever since what I remember as a child was always this little Sandy that could not write, but admire people that wrote, admire people that kept diaries. And I even have a few diaries at home where I had 2 lines. I literally couldn't write. As life progressed, about 10 years ago, I started writing blogs. So I've kept a blog. The idea actually came because when I was doing my master's degree, I met a lady, the wife of one of my professors, and she's of Chinese heritage from San Francisco. And she told me, instead of thinking about writing a book, why don't you just write stories? Just write what you remember, Sandy. And I remember very clearly one of the essays she wrote about her time with her mom in Chinatown. And so that was the reason I started writing the blog. I said, one day I may not remember, and I just want to write snippets. So in a way, Gary, maybe you can say that I've been a writer, but I've never really thought of myself as a writer. But I've been writing for maybe about 10 years or so. Yeah.
Now, usually, a memoir is in the voice of the author.
Yes.
But your book, for the most part, is in the voice of your father, Michael.
That's right.
Why did you write it that way?
That's right. And actually, since the book has come out, I've come to the realization that if I wanted the book to be mass marketed and to myself to be famous, etc., writing it in my voice would have been a better idea. However, I think one of the main reasons I chose to do it this way was because I am an avid reader, and I'm an avid reader of memoirs of Cantonese people, Chinese people. I don't read Chinese. I can understand it, but I don't read it. So all my access has been in English. And what I've noticed is we're lucky right now in Canada. We have representation. There's an attempt to improve representation of all types of people. But the literature is still mostly from children of immigrants. So I would write as in growing up, I had parents that came from XYZ place, and I grew up with the tensions of wondering who am I, etc. I haven't read a lot of things from the voice of the first immigrant of a family. And so I wonder, first of all, what that would sound like. Secondly, this is a man speaking. And most memoirs I have read of Chinese people, and there's lots of different types of Chinese people because China is so big, I haven't read much from the perspective of a male. Thirdly, my dad is 78. I haven't read a lot of things, if anything, from that perspective. So I wanted to, I guess, break out of the mold and say, what would that sound like? Would it confuse readers, or would it entice readers? Would it attract readers to try to figure it out? So I gave it a try, because the impetus, the purpose is just simply to tell readers that your story doesn't have to be overtly dramatic to be heard. It's just a story, right? And it's just a story of life lived.
No.
And so I wanted to give that. And funny enough, that you noticed, Gary, because I asked my daughter's in high school, and I said, now that you've read the book, what is different about this compared to the Simu Liu books and all the different books in the genre that you've read? And she says, oh, Mama, I don't get to read what the first generation older people experience. We read it from the children and what they see. And so I wanted to try. This is my way of bridging the gap between that first generation and the third generation, and saying, even though a lot of times in this space, Gary, we often say, well, we need to learn the language. The language is the barrier. And I'm a linguist. I totally believe in that. However, what if that third generation will never learn that language? Let's forget about the dream of learning that language. What if they never learn that language? In this case, Cantonese. Do we just sit down and just make a big sigh and say, that's it? Or are there other creative ways, perhaps, to bridge it? So that's my little way of giving homage to Dad and his voice, and giving him the space to tell the story while I am still holding the pen.
Good.
Yeah.
Can you give our listening audience the basic elements of the memoir storyline?
Yeah, so the story actually takes you to 4 different places. It starts in Canton or Guangzhou, which is in the southern part of China. And so we were able to trace back, because what I did is sit down with my dad for over a year to really retrace our family history. And so we've been able to trace it as far back as my great-grandfather. And so it starts there, but you will, because the story is told by from my dad's perspective, so you see a child growing up in abundance, in wealth. And then history happens, war happens, conflicts happen, and you see what a child how a child responds to that from his perspective. And in the context of the Chinese culture, he was a boy. Mm-hmm. He was the youngest. So he doesn't make any qualms about it. He says, for all I know, maybe the elder sisters, my mom, they were hungry. I wasn't. Right? And I find that fascinating to be able to see it from a child's perspective. But then that child grows up and eventually makes it to Hong Kong, metropolitan city, growing, and he grows alongside with it. And so you see how a male grows and tries to make a living, make a life of it. And then the interesting theme I found in the story was that every generation had its own version of diaspora, its own version of moving, its own version of, are there opportunities beyond what I see? Are there conflicts that I wish I didn't have to face, but I am facing? So what I realized is the stories the themes kept on repeating. And so you would think in Hong Kong, you're happy, you're settled. My dad got married. I was born in Hong Kong. And I said to my dad, why in the world would you pick us all up and go to Peru? Right? Like, there's no civil war. There's no, right? And so it was about space for him, space to become. And I found that very beautiful and very courageous as well, because he wasn't responding to conflict outside. It was just wanting more opportunities. And so he takes the plunge. He goes all the way to Peru. I still remember that trip. And then again, the theme repeats itself. There's conflict, there's failure, there's business failure. He loses everything, health problems. And then we see him, just like my grandma, when she was facing the difficulties in China, how they rise from it. And then you would think that's the end of the story. But then he starts thinking about us and knowing that Peru is not that dream, that parent's dream of the final space. And so the opportunity comes for us for him to send us to Canada. Mm-hmm. And again, another move, right? Another move. And you see the final movement. The final movement is him daring to dream something for himself now. Not just for survival, not just for opportunities for the next generation, but now, what if in my last chapter of life, I can actually accept the role reversal and my daughter might be able to take me to this country called Canada that I thought I would never have the qualifications to come. And so the few chapters that you see is him now in retirement age, coming and moving yet again. So I find that I find fascinating about this the story, that the themes actually repeat itself, generation from generation, and location from location, and gender to gender. It's still a family story that has the same themes. So it would take you to 4 different places. Yeah.
Well, you touched upon a little bit about the process, but how much was involvement? What time did you spend with your father in order to bring all of this memoir out?
Yeah, it's a great question that a lot of people ask me. And I said, I am lucky. I grew up in a family that told stories. So ever since I I remember grandma, I remember aunts. Everybody talks about the stories of yonder years, like, so I do have that. But in order to put together the stories in a cohesive way that made sense, especially for the Canadian reader from this generation, younger generation, I needed to sit down with my dad. And so the book is the result of around 1 year of, I wouldn't call them interviews. I started off thinking more in a Western way, sitting down with my dad over coffee and having chats and recording it. And I started off also thinking more about preservation rather than storytelling. But after probably the second meeting, I realized that's not what I'm really interested in. I'm not a historian per se. There's a lot of great people doing that. I was interested in giving my dad a safe space to tell the story as he remembers it as a 78-year-old. Mm-hmm. And so what we did, instead of the first 2 interviews, where I said to Dad, okay, let's go to the living room, sit on the yellow pristine couch that we never use and sit over half an hour and recording. That just felt very, very un-Chinese. It's not the way we do it. So the rest of the year, it was done really through boring moments, everyday moments. I just have my iPhone and recorder, mm-hmm. and it was just 10 minutes here, half an hour there, almost always over food. There's always food around. But instead of interviews, I think it was more of a conversation. It became more conversation. It became more about a space of connection. And so, of course, I had to check for facts. Of course, I have to double check. I did cross interview or talk with some of the aunts, etc. But the main thing was, can I create a safe space for somebody in this culture, in my family, in the Chinese, Cantonese background, and say, it is safe here for you to tell your story as it is. And actually, what's interesting, Gary, is in some of my book talks, I talk about, don't be scared about repeating the same question. In my Western mind, and as a parent, and as a teacher, if a student asks me the same thing several times, my conclusion is you weren't listening. But in this case, what I noticed is, because my dad would tell the story in Cantonese, I would then go home, translate it verbatim, and then I would have to contextualize it in a way that makes sense to my children's generation. Then I realized, and I would see gaps, I would send it back to my dad. He would read it, or I would read it. We would just go back and forth. Or sometimes I would just have another meeting with him and say, Dad, you remember you told me about this? Can you tell me the story again? It wasn't until the second or third repetition that my dad finally, and this is almost literally what he said in Cantonese, he says, oh, you really want to know. And I said, what have we been doing all this time? And I realized the first few times were highly curated stories. It was it was still the story. The story didn't change, but there was an inherent, I'm not sure you young people really want to hear. And so I had to actually, without knowing, I got into this process of, oh, this is what buy-in looks like in this context when you're talking with somebody from a previous generation. And because he kept on telling me, oh, I didn't realize you really want to know. Or I would tell him, oh, like I gave your granddaughter this script, right? This part. And she read it and she's asking, and he's like, really? They really want? I said, Dad, I've been telling you. but it's ingrained in his mind that, yeah, you say you want to hear it, but not really, right? And so it was actually the repetition and me retelling what I heard back to him that proved to him that, oh, you really want to be that audience. And I realized if there's no audience, why would he tell the story?
Yeah.
And so the second half of the year actually was a lot more, I would say I felt the connection much deeper. The first part, it was more like the same type of stories, but a lot of it was just dates, names.
Skimming the surface.
Here it is, done, right? Yeah. But the hard stuff, the listening in between the lines, what do you mean by this? Or what does he mean by this? That came the second half, yeah.
You are listening to author Sandy Ho on Writers for Readers on CHOP FM 102.7. Now, did you conduct, I think you mentioned it, you did some more research beyond. What was involved with that? So,
not deep research, because halfway through I realized I want to preserve. I want to also preserve stories, but I didn't need necessarily fact check the story, but I did need to fact check the context of what was happening. And so, like I said to you, the story spans through 4 different locations. So one of the things I did is I rebuilt our family timeline, literally on a horizontal line, very long, from the 1900s all the way to today, with everybody's dates, birth dates, weddings, etc. What I also did right beside it was to build another timeline of what was happening in history, in politics, geopolitics, society-wise, etc., in each of these locations where my parents or my family was located. And so that was not as hard to find the fact checks because, first of all, I love history. So I've always been inclined to look. It was more about just double checking that the dates and the years match. Yeah. What was magical, Gary, though, because remember, I've always grown up with these stories, not perhaps with the nuance of it, but I've known these stories. But they felt like fragments. And what happened when I built it and I saw it on a timeline, horizontal timeline, and I literally had 2 timelines side by side. When that historical timeline was placed right beside my family's timeline, magic happened. I was like, oh, that was real. It happened. And I don't know how else to explain it, but it stuck. The second thing I had to do was some of the early stories that you read in the book. I did the math and I said to my dad, Dad, you were 4 years old when that happened. How could you remember all of that? And so what I did is cross-reference it with some interviews with my aunts. And I asked them. So I did interview a few family members to just check, and lo and behold, I was very surprised. But they say, yeah, it's exactly what happened. But my dad is one of those people, if you do believe it, he says he believes, he says he remembers the day he learned to walk. So, and I've heard over the years that there are some people that can actually remember that far. But yeah, he remembers a lot. And so that's been my privilege, and that's made my job so much easier. So a lot of people ask me what took the longest. The writing didn't take the longest. It was more the editing and all of that stuff later. But the accumulating it, getting the facts was not actually as hard because he has pristine memory. We went through some family pictures, and he could tell me not just who was who, but what year it was taken, where it was taken, what was the name of the restaurant it was like he can remember so much. You ask me from my iPhone what some of the pictures are from, and I can't even tell you, right? So I did some of it, but I wouldn't say I spent an exorbitant amount researching. Yeah.
Could you read a short excerpt from the book for our audience?
I would love to. So I decided to read about the time I am involved in the story.
No.
So this is later in the book, chapter 42, and the title of the chapter is "Fly, Children, Fly." And remember, the book is told in my father's voice. So imagine I am a male's voice. But here you go. We began looking for opportunities for Sandy, that's me. When Moxie and Simo mentioned a high school they knew that offered room and board, we eagerly explored the possibility, filled with hope for the future. In my eyes, the Canadian lifestyle felt refreshingly simple, with its people embodying an uncomplicated and straightforward spirit, especially compared to life in the United States. The decision was made. Sandy would go overseas to finish high school with hopes of continuing on to university and then finding a way to create a new life up north in a land far, far away that only the fortunate few could dream of calling home. Plans were set in motion, and I was grateful for this new opportunity, yet I couldn't help feeling uneasy. The school Simo had recommended was a Christian school located in a small town in Western Canada. There was room and board, which simplified our plans for my daughter, as she wouldn't have to worry about commuting or cooking. I wonder if Sandy, unlike me, would struggle with homesickness. Although my own room and board experience in secondary school in Hong Kong had been vastly different from what she was about to face, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried. I didn't know if she would adjust. On the night of July 6, 1990, after an earlier than usual dinner, I packed 2 blue suitcases, the same suitcases that had taken me from Hong Kong to Peru 9 years ago, into the car, and with them, my small, stubborn bundle of hopes for my daughter. The cold Lima air in July clung to us as we drove through the busy streets toward Jorge Chavez International Airport. At the check-in desk, I saw friends from her school and from our church gathered to say goodbye. Their faces made the moment feel both ordinary and sacred. Then Sandy, 15, brave, tears in her eyes, waved to us and walked through the security gates away from us. I had taken her as far as I could. She stood at the edge of a new door, and she had to open it herself.
Very good. Where is your book available?
It's available on Amazon. That's probably the easiest way, and in selected Indigo stores. So, yeah.
Very good. Thank you to author Sandy Ho for giving us No Way But Through on Writers for Readers. We'll take a short break and be right back on CHOP FM 102.7.